Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Academy update. This morning we'll be covering the Kreston Academies Benchmark Report 2022, which came out a few weeks ago. My name is Mike Farwell. I'm Head of Charities and Education at James Cooper Kreston. We act for approximately 40 academies, so this will be a real whistle-stop tour of the Benchmark Report. I'm joined today by one of our Academy managers, Becky Foy.
Good morning.
And behind the scenes, Georgia Burrell from our marketing team will be dealing with the slides and all the technology, which, as a man of a certain age, I'm sure, be entirely incapable of dealing with. So thanks very much for that, Georgia. So we've got a good turnout this morning, although it's half term. I think we see from the attendees it's mainly finance directors and school business managers rather than governors or trustees. In terms of housekeeping, you should all hopefully, as you've received an invite to this webinar, will have had a hard copy or an electronic copy of the report. If you haven't received that, then do let us know and we can send one through. It's not essential that you have this in front of you while we go through the session, and it's also available on our website. Georgia will also send you a recording of the webinar afterwards, in the unlikely event that you want to watch it again, and perhaps the more likely event that you might think that you have one or two colleagues or possibly governors or trustees who might find it of interest. There's also a facility to ask questions, which we'll deal with at the end, so you should have a Q&A box, so do submit your questions. So let's make a start. So in terms of introduction, the Kreston Academies Benchmark Report 22, it's a countrywide survey based upon the 10 firms in the Kreston UK group that deal with academies. So we're going to be looking at some of the key facts, how multi-academy trust finances are shaping up. I was looking back at the session we did on this last year, and I'd said at that stage it had been a remarkable year, and I think it's fair to say that it has been another remarkable year. So based on over 300 trusts and 1,500 schools, so quite wide-ranging. It's all based upon the August 21 accounts. There's analysis in the report by primary, secondary school, multi-academy trusts. At the back of the report, there's the section of all the individual figures for the 3 different categories, and it's quite useful to, I think, to compare your trust to the averages. And even if benchmarking doesn't necessarily give you all the answers, it does often stimulate some thought. And worth mentioning that over 50% of pupils in the UK today are educated in an academy, so it is a massive sector. I will do some of the highlights of the report. Becky will cover some of the detailed numbers, and then at the end I'll come back and we'll cover some governance and internal assurance. So, George, if we move on to the next slide, so we just cover the highlights. So I think it's fair to say, despite the easing of restrictions, that COVID-19 uncertainties do remain, and there may, of course, be a long tail in terms of the challenges that we see into the future, and particularly, I think, in terms of education and attainment. And of course, there have been huge operational challenges in the year. We're looking at testing, cleaning, technology issues, exams, school closures, etc., a whole raft of things that school staff have had to deal with. So, we said last year 2020 had been a year like no other. I suppose 2021 has been a year a bit like the previous year, but certainly like no years prior to 2020. One of the key messages, we've seen record surpluses across the sector. I mean, some of that is buoyed by COVID-19 support, and there have been other impacts on costs in terms of reduced costs due to school closures, exam fees, reduced supply costs, etc. So we have seen record surpluses, and I think 2020 the surpluses were, remarkably high. But again, that has been the case this year. There has been a loss of trading income compared with the pre-COVID period, but I think we've seen that some trading income has come back during the August 21 year, and hopefully, of course, in 21-22 year, it will be improved again, and then hopefully by the 22-23 year, I'm reluctant to predict that the world will return to normal, but hopefully some degree of normality will return. So record surpluses for secondary schools and multi-academy trusts. I mean, I was struck by the fact that the average multi-academy trust's surplus in these and the survey was approaching £500,000. In terms of primary schools, and I think important to remember that many primary schools are still in the maintained sector, so there's not many standalone primary schools operating as academies. So we're slightly reduced services for those schools, as we'll see later when Becky goes through some of the detail. So if we move on to the next slide. So we're also seeing fewer trusts with a cumulative deficit. I think it's less than 4% now. In 2019, it was over 8%. We're seeing fewer in-year deficits. Not surprisingly, as a result of these surpluses, we're seeing free reserves increasing and cash balances up. Again, interesting to note that the average cash balance in Multi-Academy Trust, 3.26 million, up substantially on the previous year. One thing that we've often talked about in the past on this annual benchmark report webinar has been the number of MATs that are doing pooling of their general annual grant income. We've also done webinars on that specific topic. Looking back to 2017, less than 1% were doing pooling. I think we're now up to 14%, so some significant changes. I think we're also seeing trusts looking to take on more schools, more from that later. And then we're also seeing increased centralisation. I think certainly in the early days of Multi-Academy Trust, individual schools often operated very much in isolation and then were sort of brought together at the year end. We're now seeing much more centralisation generally, and there is now substantial evidence, which I think wasn't always the case in the early days, that centralisation does bring efficiency and cost savings. So I think you can expect that trend to continue. We're also seeing trusts forecasting 3-year and year surpluses, but I think we're expecting to see by 23 those surpluses will be reduced. So an interesting year, lots of operational challenges, and broadly speaking, record surpluses, and I think we'll see the move to Multi-Academy Trust continue in the future with more centralisation. However, we move on to the next slide. There are some challenges on the horizon, as you might imagine. I think there is uncertainty ahead. We will see, that the long-term impacts of COVID-19 in terms of educational and resourcing issues. I think we will see, I think the academy sector is one where the funding is in a permanent state of flux, and no doubt we will see funding being a challenge well into the future. We're seeing the potential for unfunded increases in local government pension scheme costs. You'll all be aware, I'm sure, of likely impact on energy costs. I think there have been some energy cost savings in 2021 due to school closures, but I think everyone's forecasting soaring energy costs in 2022. And this morning's news, of course, is likely to increase significantly the energy prices, the invasion of Ukraine. I think we'll see staff costs likely to rise. One of the remarkable features of the last year or so, particularly the last 6 months, is all organisations, private sector, public sector, third sector, are seeing challenges in terms of recruitment and retention. I think many people have stayed put during the last 2 years because of the uncertainty. So I think we're expecting to see some challenges there in the future. And of course, staff costs are around 75% or so of total cost of academy, so that will likely have a big impact. We're also seeing general inflationary pressures other than the pressures on energy costs. I think those of you as old as me will remember the days of the 1970s when inflation was up to 25%, and we saw this horrendous inflationary spiral. Hopefully, it won't reach those levels. I think we're also seeing some challenges in terms of staff welfare, mental well-being, staff burnout. That's well publicised a result of the pandemic, and I think we'll need to see schools, putting more emphasis on that. And then I think risk management has been a really interesting feature of the last couple of years. I think often in academies, risk management, and indeed in other charities and other organisations, risk management can be a very static process. I think we saw schools responding remarkably quickly and well to the challenges of COVID-19 and lockdown periods, government announcements, testing, closures, the use of technology, etc. So I think there's been some really great, live risk management, which has been relevant in recent times. We'll see a few new risks later on in the session. And then finally, the report does predict that schools will need to be more innovative in the future in terms of what they do, looking perhaps at how they generate additional income. There's reports of MultiAcademy Trust, for example, providing IT and back office support to other schools. We may see some transactions. We'll see things, property transactions. We may well see quite a lot happening on the energy front. So I think, as the world changes, I think schools, like every other organisation, will need to be innovative and flexible. So that's very much the highlights and what's coming in the future. I'll now hand over to Becky to go through some of the detail. Becky.
Thank you. So moving on to the financial position. As already noted, there's been some massive challenges placed on schools with continued changing environments for a second year, albeit schools have probably been better prepared compared with the unknowns of COVID in the prior year. Looking at the actual numbers, it can be difficult for academies to work out where referring to surplus and deficits. However, if we look at the table, the average in-year position, excluding capital, has seen an increased trend from 2019 to 2021 now, with record-breaking surpluses being recorded in the current year. We have, however, seen a small dip in performance, with primaries reporting an average surplus of now 14,000, which isn't unreasonable, as they've been less affected by lockdown closures, which has resulted in a more normalised year-to-year position. Whereas the MATs, we've seen exceptional increases with a rise to an average of 467,000 in-year surplus. This has been driven by a number of factors, including the return of some trading income, but primarily through large receipts of the COVID-19 grants. The cost per MATs also increased in the year, but appears to be limited to inflation, as a lot of costs that are incurred haven't yet recovered to pre-pandemic levels. However, the surpluses now being made in MATs are now starting to show that they're reaping the benefits of being larger and more diversified. Across the board, we have seen some great performances by the business managers and their teams to overcome the challenges they have experienced over the last 2 years, from both a financial and operational perspective, as this is evident in the current year results. Moving on, so many academies were reporting either a break-even or deficit position for the autumn term, but did recover in the spring and summer due to repeated cost savings that they've experienced. Trading income has still not yet recovered to pre-pandemic levels. However, where this isn't a significant proportion of school income anyway, the cost savings that they had received in the year have far outweighed the loss of this income. I think this is probably a good point. We've got some polls to do, so it might be a good chance to do one of them now, Georgia, if that's okay. So the poll is for the current 21-22 year, what financial position are you reporting for the autumn term? It'll be quite interesting to see what it is looking like, due to the fact that last year we were kind of in a deficit position. So it'll be interesting to see if you're now looking at a surplus or not. So I'll give you a few minutes to answer that. Hopefully they are starting to come in. Georgia, have we got all of them in yet?
Yep, looks like everyone's answered. So I'll finish that poll now and I'll share the results.
Perfect. So that's quite interesting. So it looks like everybody is now, well, most people, 67%, are looking at a surplus position, which may be likely to some of these COVID-19 grants that are starting to come into the schools. Cool. So moving on, I think we can move to the next slide, Georgia. Great. So with these surpluses being made, this has improved the position of cumulative deficits reported in trusts, with now only 3.8% of trusts reporting cumulative deficits, compared with 8.2% and in 2019, which is a good improvement. And then moving on to the COVID-19 grants, in a bid to help pupils catch up with their lost attainment, we have seen the government committing nearly 5 billion of additional funding, of which 1 billion was received in the current financial year. However, we have seen that a lot of this hasn't been utilised due to resource restraints, and will be looking at being spent in the next financial year. With forecasting, I think we are used to quite a lot of pessimism in future forecasting, and there are still a lot of uncertainties going forward from the impact of the surging energy prices, general rises in inflation, and political commitments to increase salaries. However, the number of trusts predicting a deficit has fallen to an average of 35% compared to 41% in the prior year, which is again a good improvement. But we also do tend to see that actual results do pan out a lot better than forecasting, as there usually is a lot of caution being applied from both income and cost uncertainties going forward. But overall, from a financial position side, it is showing that the financial position of all academies are more robust than they were a few years ago. Next slide, please, Georgia. So moving on to the income section, we have already covered a lot of the COVID consideration, but to highlight the point, over the last 18 months, the government has made a number of announcements regarding additional funding being made available to schools to assist with the educational impact that COVID-19 has had on students. This did include 700 million for the recovery premium in summer schools, 1.4 billion for free tuition and mentoring, and then in the autumn budget, a further 4.7 billion was announced for core funding and 1.8 billion for recovery funding, which is good news going forward to try help catch up on the lost education. The average grant GAG income per pupil has also risen across primary, secondaries and maths in 2021, with secondaries reporting the highest figure of £5,087 per pupil. This is still quite a way off the targeted 2010 levels in real terms, but the latest announcements of funding may be the step in the right direction. Capital funding per pupil in SATs and maths have also decreased in 2021, albeit the decrease in maths of 1% is a fairly small drop compared to the 17% and 31% evident in primaries and secondaries, respectively. The movement is a little surprising, given the knowledge of a lot of academies have been very successful in the year with approved SIF bids. However, we do know that a lot of the bids were approved again later in the financial year, with some of them even being pushed into the next financial year. In both these instances, we are likely to see a lot of the revenue also being pushed back into the FY22 year. In addition, a lot of the academies found it quite difficult to get companies quoting or even commencing work due to shortages in availability within the building industry, and whereby most schools undertake large capital projects during the summer months due to the severe disruption that it causes, and with delays in building works during the summer period, that has pushed back work, and we'll likely see a lot of this now being conducted in summer 22 as opposed to the year just gone. Linked to this is also the capital expenditure, whereby the government has provided 1.3 million laptops in the year. This was the necessary spend to enable suitable online home learning when school closures have been in effect. There isn't a huge amount to say about the hard funding formula with regards to the transition. The hope was for it to be implemented in the 22-23 year. However, it has been since confirmed that it will be delayed with a new potential implementation date of 23-24 year, but this is yet to be agreed. Overall, there appears to be a lack of clarity for decisions over medium to long-term funding, but with the sector performing well over the last 2 years, and large surpluses being made, trusts are in a far better and more robust position to be able to cope with the future uncertainties of income. If we move on again, Georgia. Thank you. So moving on to staff costs, the first expenditure, in the first section we'll be looking at relates to the staff costs. For the 21 year, the average staff cost as a percentage of total costs has remained static and comparable across primary, secondaries and maths at around 75.3%. We have, however, noted a reduction in both teaching staff costs and supply costs, which shows more money is being spent on non-teaching costs as a proportion. We have, however, noted this is more relevant to secondaries and maths, with primaries remaining fairly static due to having less opportunities to deploy staff to other areas. In the autumn budget, Rishi confirmed that the pay sector freezes would end, which is positive for schools as they've now operated through a very difficult 2 years. And with the need to entice new workers to the industries, current level salaries are falling short of being attractive to new people. Also, to try and help overcome some of the salary issues, the government states that it is still committed to increasing the starting level for teachers to 30,000, utilising a proportion of the £4.7 billion of investment of the core funding to fund this. The trouble with this, though, however, is the implementation date again for the FY 22-23 year is no longer achievable, and they haven't yet set a date for the implementation. Moving on to head teacher remuneration, we have also seen an increase of this of around 4.5%, which we believe Trust should closely monitor, as the ESFA are now paying more and more attention to leadership salaries to ensure that they're reasonable and they can be justified going forward. We have also seen some large increases in the average school business manager remuneration. Again, this is probably not surprising, as trusts are looking for more experienced staff to help meet the more complex requirements of reporting that the ESFA are looking for. The next slide, please, Georgia. And then moving on to the non-staff cost element. So for the second year in a row, we have seen noticeably lower costs than prior to the pandemic. Having said that, it is important to understand if these reductions are going to be temporary or permanent due to better controlling of costs. We have continued to see lower exam, catering and maintenance costs throughout the COVID period. This should hopefully start to return to pre-pandemic levels in FY22, with schools hopefully being open for a full 12 months. So the financial year 22 should hopefully give a clearer picture in terms of whether any of these cost savings had over the last 2 years are permanent or not. So moving on and looking at kind of like the energy costs, we're expected to see some significant increases across the school of all schools up to potentially 50%. This is going to drive a lot more emphasis of schools becoming more efficient to help control the costs, and they will look to seek additional capital projects to implement changes. And whereby capital projects cannot be conducted due to money restraints and failed SIF bids, schools will be looking at how they can improve their current systems to be as efficient as possible. One of the other costs that we're expecting to increase quite a lot is catering, which at the moment is currently returning to normal levels. However, with food prices rising, it's likely that the catering costs will continue to increase over and above the pre-pandemic levels. And with some suppliers moving out of the industry completely, it may give rise to higher quotes, as they are finding it more difficult to make money on meals and trying to push these cost pressures onto the schools. Therefore, to assist with tackling cost control, the ESFA are continuing to provide independent school resource management advisors to work with Trust free of charge over the next 3 years, after a continued success of the programme since the 2018 pilot. The use of this may be more important than ever due to the forecast rises in both staff and non-staff costs to ensure schools aren't falling back into deficit positions. Moving on, Georgia, thank you. So the last section I'll be speaking about before I hand over is the balance sheet. and not surprising, as a result of the surpluses being derived in the current and prior year, has had a knock-on effect on both cash balances and reserves. The cash and free reserves have increased across the board in primary, secondaries and maths, with maths now reporting an increase in cash to around 3.26 million, some of which can be explained to timing differences when grants and associated expenditure are incurred, having already noted that a lot of academies are yet to spend large amounts of their COVID catch-up. However, given the large surpluses and the better reserves being made, trusts are now looking forward into the future and making active plans to spend an element of this carried forward position. We have also seen progress in the school rebuilding programme. In June 2020, the government announced the school rebuilding programme to assist with major capital rebuild and refurbishing over the next 10 years. The project announced its first 100 schools in the current year, and a consultation is currently in progress with a pending outcome to confirm how they're going to prioritise future schools, as the programme in total will only cover 500. And with over 22,000 schools in England, this is only a tiny proportion, so it will be interesting to see the criteria that will be set going forward. In addition to large capital works, we have also seen an increase in capital expenditure relating to technology. This wasn't surprising given the need for newer technology and the supply of IT equipment, which was required over the COVID period to help provide the delivery of suitable education remotely, a lot of which again was covered by government grants. And then the last two bits to look at, so the LGPS deficit, we have seen increases over the past 3 years, and the LGPS is due for its next valuations in 2022, and it's likely there will be increased contributions for future periods. However, it is important to note that the LGPS deficits will be one of the large numbers featured on an academy balance sheet, though there isn't any expectation that there will be any immediate requirement to cover this deficit, but it does mean that the deficit on the balance sheet, with this, it will mean that academies will be paying more contributions into the future. And then with the TPS, as you're aware, back in 2019, contributions for TPS went up significantly from 16.4% to 23.68%, albeit the increases have been funded so far by the government and hopefully will continue into the future. This is due for another review in 2022 and a potential implementation in 2024 for new percentage contribution rates, but at present it's unclear what these will be. So that's my section done. Moving back over to Mike.
Thanks very much, Becky. So if we move on to Multi-Academy Trusts, just by way of background, we're running well time-wise, so we should be finished by 10:40, which I think was the allowance we gave, 40 minutes for the webinar. So just some basic background, you'll see there that the number of academies, schools has not increased significantly from the previous year. I think COVID has, in so many areas of life, has put a hold on things, but interesting to see that there is only 2 more maths on the survey compared to the previous year. But the number of single academy trusts has dropped a bit. And just by way of broad background, 38% of primaries at the moment are academies and 79% for secondary. So quite a long way to go in the primary sector, where one imagines that many of these will join multi-academy trusts, but only 1 in 5 secondaries, not yet academy. Big increase in the average number of schools in our survey. So it's now at 7.5, up a bit from the previous year, 4.5 in 2017. So the average size of maths is getting greater. As a result of COVID, there's a drop in rebrokerage. Very few schools moved in that way. I mentioned earlier the gag pudding continued increase, and I think we expect that to increase further in the future. In terms of the central services recharge, we're still seeing nearly 3/4 of multi-academy trusts using a top slice, and of those using a top slice, 61% of those were using 5%, although there are some variations and some charging 8% or more, but 5% very common. In terms of national messages, National Schools Commissioner said that every school ideally should be part of the MAT in due course. We wait to see how long that might take. Some interesting questions around the level of free reserves required in academies as the size of multi-academy trust grows. And again, as I mentioned earlier, increased centralisation. So 97% of multi-academy trusts now fully or partly centralised. So there's some of the key messages for multi-academy trusts. If we move on to some governance issues, so we've got a couple of slides here. Governance is really important at any time, but particularly in the challenging times that we've had recently and as a result of COVID and as we move out of the COVID period. So the importance of updating trust development plans, establishing key priorities. There's been quite a lot of discussion of attainment gap varying quite widely across the country. So we'll see what happens there in terms of raising standards in the future. And I think there's a suggestion from government that, smaller schools might be transferred into larger, more successful multi-academy trusts, to help in their improvement process. Big decisions for both the larger single academy trusts and multi-academy trusts in terms of whether they grow into the future, but interesting to see the some significant growth aspirations there in terms of 65% are expecting a growth in numbers into the future. I think there has been a slowdown in growth over the last 2 years, but I think we'll see that continue into the future. I think sustainability and climate change is a big issue for the world as a whole, but I think it will be an important issue for academy schools in the context of particularly younger people who are often quite concerned, as indeed many of us slightly older people are concerned about climate change. So that will be a big focus, I think. And as we move into these sort of ever-changing times, good decision making will be really important. So financial modelling, to help understand the funding pressures and the implications of changes in funding. Due diligence would be particularly important when you're looking at bringing in a new school into your multi-academy trust, reviewing the effectiveness and structure, etc. So a whole range of different things in terms of making sure that decision making is not done on the hoof based on intuition, but is based on hopefully some facts. So moving on to the second governance slide, monitoring mental health and well-being will be important. There's some data in the benchmarking report about that. I was slightly surprised, whilst the numbers are reasonably substantial in terms of academies monitoring this issue, I was slightly surprised by the number that weren't. So that will be a big focus, I think, in the future. And the role of trustees in supporting and challenging management, both on mental well-being and many other issues. So I think the role of the board is really important. So we're just going to launch a second poll now. So I'd ask you to participate. Quite a lot of people didn't respond in the first poll, so it'd be great if more could respond in this one. So this is, have you carried out a trustees or governors skills audit in the last 3 years? There's been a lot of talk that academies should be doing this as a matter of good practice. So if I can ask you to vote, and we'll give you a few seconds as the votes come in. So have you carried out a trustees or governors skills audit in the last 3 years? Quite interesting to see what the results are here. So Georgia, hopefully we've got sufficient number of responses. You can launch the results.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll end the poll now and here are the results.
So interestingly, about 60% of people are saying that they are aware that trustees or skills audits have been carried out. 40% don't know. So that I think that's reasonably positive. I think as it's something that's happening and it's more important across the sector. In terms of what a skills audit can do, it can identify gaps that one needs to fill on the trustees board, but occasionally it's also really rather useful in identifying some hidden talent. So you may well find some governors or trustees who have some talents that you weren't aware of. If we can just close that slide now, thanks, Georgia. Carrying out governance reviews just to make sure the governance is working well. I think it's sensible to do that externally rather than internally. In terms of the size of boards, I think the data there has been quite consistent for a few years now in terms of the number of trustees and governors. As in many areas of life, in the importance of the diversity challenge. I think in terms of the survey, I think 93% of trustees were from a white British background, which of course is greater than the average across the whole population. So no doubt, like many organisations, some work to do there. In terms of other messages in the survey, I haven't brought all of them out, but one thing that is interesting was that half of trustees are aged between 50 and 69, so quite difficult to engage younger people in being an academy trustee. And of course, there will be some older than 69 as well. So the challenge of getting younger people involved. But interesting to see in terms of gender diversity that over 50% of the chairs of academies were actually female. So that's quite interesting. So really important to plan to increase the effectiveness of governance. So if we move on now to the final section of our webinar in terms of internal assurance, I think many of you will be very aware that there's been more focus on internal assurance, internal scrutiny, internal audit, whatever you want to call it, in recent times. I think some of that has been impacted by COVID-19, and I think we certainly have seen a more positive approach to risk management during the COVID-19 period. Naturally, internal assurance has been a bit impacted by just some of the challenges of carrying out the work, while there were many other priorities. I think in terms of some of the risks that we will be seeing into the future, I think hopefully this will be quite a short-term risk, but in terms of staff absences and COVID providing some significant challenges in terms of education. We mentioned earlier the question of staff turnover, so I think we'll see that in the whole, the position in terms of staff recruitment and retention being a bigger challenge in the future. I think increasing feature and risk registers will be the whole mental health and wellbeing issue, so that would relate both to staff and pupils. We've mentioned climate change and sustainability, so clearly some risk there. All organisations, I think, are seeing cyber security as a more significant risk than it was in the past. All sorts of things, very complex areas, so maybe worth looking at. Looking in that area. And if you're looking at expanding, I think there's always onboarding risks with new schools joining multi-academy trusts in terms of sort of hidden problems or issues, and also the question of the management time that's required. So we are seeing broadly an increase in the number of days that academies are requesting in terms of internal assurance. Worth mentioning the Academy Trust handbook that was issued last year, much more focused on non-financial areas. So issues like IT, health and safety, estates management are areas that maybe need to be looked at, sometimes carried out perhaps by people other than the individuals carrying out your internal assurance work. So you may be able to get internal assurance on things in other ways. Health and safety, I think, particularly important, as we are seeing the health and safety executive taking a much more aggressive approach in compliance with health and safety. And then if we move on to the final slide, many of you, I'm sure, will have seen internal assurance reports. We've just flagged up here some of the key issues arising in internal assurance reports. I won't go through all of these detail, but I'll just pick out a few. So issues around the usefulness of risk registers, trying to make sure the risk registers are sufficient, they're up to date, it's a live process and it's not just something that's done once a year, and that the registers and risk management are assessed during the year. There are often issues around order approval and obtaining quotes. I think we often see issues around support for pay levels in terms of having appropriate documentation, in terms of contracts and increases, etc. We often see fixed asset registers not being well updated, and often a challenge if you get behind with an asset register, keeping it up to date. And then finally, I think we're seeing more situations where people are leaving an organisation, but the cut-off point in terms of them being denied access to IT systems not working terribly well, and then being allowed access to systems for a period after their leave, which is clearly not ideal and creates, I think, GDPR issues. So that brings us to the end. If we just move on to the final slide. So I think we're just at 40 minutes. So Georgia, can you sort of flag up any questions that we've had?
Thanks, Mike. We have had a couple of questions come in. So let's look at this first one. So what will be the impact of the withdrawal of some independent schools from the TPS?
All right, thanks. That's a great question. So there are around about 6% of the 6 or 7% of pupils in the UK who are educated in independent schools. There's around about 1,200 independent schools altogether, and so far around 300 of those independent schools have withdrawn from the TPS because of the rising costs, and that's a figure that will only increase as these schools look at alternative provision. They haven't received any government support in terms of the increased TPS contributions. So this will mean that the contributions into the teachers' pension scheme, will reduce. Potentially at the moment, not a huge impact, but if we find that 1,000 of those 1,200 do reduce, that will be sort of around about 5% of contributions will reduce. That may well have an impact on the TPS in the future. Worth mentioning that, of course, academies don't have any option about being in the TPS where independent schools can do. There may be some opportunities in terms of your recruitment. People working in independent schools who may be very disaffected by having to withdraw from the teachers' pension scheme may consider the academy sector quite attractive. I think, as Becky mentioned earlier, it's likely that TPS rates will increase into the future. I think some work that's been done by the Independent Schools Bursars Association suggests that contributions may go up in 2 or 3 years by around 30%. So that will be a massive increase on current contributions. And of course, we will wait to see whether or how much support the government will give to academies in that area. So I've rambled on a bit there, but are there some other questions, Georgia?
Yes, there is one more. I think, Becky, this might be one for you, as you touched on this earlier. What are schools doing to control energy costs?
Thanks, Georgia. So we've seen a few things that schools are looking to do at the moment. One being smaller things like energy efficient lighting, trying to match heating with building occupancies, and even trying to play with, thermostats to see if they can lower the levels at all to help improve their energy that way. Alternatively, with some of the older build schools, the schools are looking at applying for capital projects which will help improve the facilities, kind of like the windows, the roofing, insulation, etc., to help with that. And finally, schools are looking at specialists to come in to try and help manage these costs and give alternative solutions that they may be able to use going forward.
Great, thanks very much, Becky. So I think that's all the questions we've had, Georgia, is that right?
Oh, yes, sorry, that's it for questions.
Okay, fine. So I think we're at the end now, so just under 45 minutes. So I hope you've enjoyed the session very much. A whistle-stop tour. Do have a look in detail at the report if you haven't done so. It's a really good read. So Georgia will send you all a recording of the webinar to deal with, distribute as you see fit. If any other questions arise that you think of subsequent to the webinar, you've got Becky and my contact details there if you wanted to give us a ring. We'd welcome any calls. And finally, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much for joining us. Bye-bye.